I come from a middle class minority family, upper middle class. My mother and father were both lawyers. My mom is a Jamaican immigrant. My father is black and white. They met in D.C. in law school. And I was raised with the anticipation of becoming a lawyer myself. And so my parents taught me formal rhetoric, logic, public speaking, and all those kinds of things. However, when I was around 12 years old, I began rebelling pretty strong. I discovered rap music, specifically gangster rap, at that time, and was really fascinated with that other world that I didn't grow up in. Again, I grew up in a middle-class black community neighborhood. I really delved into gangster rap music, and when I was around 14, turning 15 years old, I joined a gang, specifically called a gang called Crips. And for the next few years, I was a gang member, doing everything from selling drugs to, because of my background, I felt the need to try to prove myself to my peers more. And so I was known to have a very hot temper, very angry, used to go to school with a razor blade in my mouth, carried a gun, and was just a very angry person. I was an atheist that believed enough about God to know that I hated him if he did exist, and was just very much given over to violence and just rebelliousness. When I was 12 years old, I had my first serious bout with depression. It was spontaneous. I didn't really know what was happening, but I went from being very happy to being extremely depressed to the point of suicidal. And that was one of the things that did kind of lead me into gang life as well, just longing for a sense of belonging and community. But throughout my teen years, I struggled with severe depression. It wasn't until I was 18 that I was diagnosed, or they told me that I was bipolar. And so a lot of the anger, a lot of the aggression, a lot of the hopelessness was kind of birthed out of that. And by God's grace, I got into college. I went to West Georgia University. And in my first semester at West Georgia, I remember walking back to my dorm room. And I looked very different now. I would have had been a blunt or a black amount hanging from a blue rag bandana that I had wrapped around my head. But I was walking back to my dorm room to eat my lunch, because I would just go buy food and then take it and eat it alone. And was contemplating on killing myself, just going back to my dorm room, blowing my brains out. And as I was walking back, there was this big field, huge field, and there was a concert that was going on in the field. And it was a rap concert. And so I stopped to listen a little bit. They weren't all that good, but I was listening. I was a little bit intrigued. And then I started hearing them rapping about Jesus. And I kind of laughed and was like, what in the world is going on here? And so I kind of scoffed at it and began walking. And then I saw the guy who was actually rapping on stage. He stopped rapping in the middle of his verse, jumped off the stage, and ran across the field straight up to me. And he began just talking with me, and he was just super friendly, was super engaging. He didn't share the gospel with me, but he told me that he would love to have lunch with me the following day. And that began a friendship of several months of him and some other brothers who were part of a campus ministry, just reaching out to me, just befriending me, having me over for lunch, just engaging with me, talking with me. And with my lawyer background, I was one of those guys that was asking all those questions that they didn't know the answers to. But they would tell me they didn't know the answers to. They would go find those answers and then come back and talk with me. And one of the things that stand out very clear to me was they tried their best, and one of the things that they kept trying to get me to do was say the sinner's prayer. They would constantly come to me and say, hey, if you just say this prayer, God would save you. And my response was always, you guys don't know the things that I've done. There's no way that a superstitious prayer is going to save me. I need more than a prayer. And several months went by with them trying to get me to say this prayer to get saved. And I knew that if there was a God, and if I did offend him as the gospel proclaims, then I needed more than just simply a prayer to save me. Long story short, there was a preacher who preached one evening. I came up to him under conviction with the classical, what must I do to be saved? He told me to say a prayer. We kind of got in a little back-to-back where I was like, I'm tired of you asking me to say this superstitious prayer. And he was like, Kyle, I'm tired of trying to get you to say this prayer. Why don't you just go up to the attic, cry out to God until he saves you? And so I thought that was reasonable. I went up to the attic, a couple men went with me, some of my friends who were building with me over that season, and I cried out to God and asked him to show up. And he showed up in a very supernatural, profound way that left me on my back crying out for mercy, and all the sins that I ever committed just flooding my memory. And I was in that moment, the gospel came to be clear, to make sense to me. I was called to proclaim the gospel, and I left that evening knowing that I didn't even know what a preacher was. I had no Christian background whatsoever, but I left there knowing that I was called to be a preacher, and that I was saved, that God forgave me for my sins, and that I wanted to give the rest of my life to proclaiming the goodness of God to others. Counseling came into picture, one, just because of my own background with depression and my struggles there. I did not seek counseling, to be honest. A lot of that came from shame, personal shame of being that level of vulnerability. When I came to seminary, I came with my ambitions were clear. I was going to pursue historical theology, get several degrees in that, and then go off somewhere in isolation and write books. I'm a book nerd. I wanted to be a book nerd, and I wanted to kind of do that. And when I was in my undergrad program, I signed up to do a preaching major. And because of my background with my parents, again, my parents began teaching me rhetoric and public speaking when I was about 5-6 years old. A lot of the classes were redundant within the preaching major because I had already been trained for 10, 15 years at this point within public speaking. So I switched over to biblical counseling for two reasons. One, because I could get out sooner because I didn't need the biblical languages, and so I said I could do that later. And then two, curiosity. I took an intro to biblical counseling course, and I was like, hey, this is telling me a lot of the things that I wish I would have known, when I was 17, 18, contemplating suicide and struggling with depression. Once I changed my majors to counseling, I just fell in love with the material. I fell in love with the content, just the reality of helping people, ministering the word of God in such a way in which came alongside people in their pursuit of sanctification, in their pursuit of glorifying God within the midst of their struggles and obstacles. I just fell in love with that work. I loved public speaking. I love preaching, but sitting across from someone and being able to just that relational and personal connection and that intimacy was something that I was deeply drawn to. And so that began, I'm finishing up my degree in historical theology, my master's, but my passion is soul care, and specifically one-on-one personal ministering of the word.